Tensions erupted in a Dallas courtroom that brisk autumn morning when U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett found herself unexpectedly on the defendant's side. The atmosphere inside the stately George L. Allen courthouse was charged with anticipation as Jasmine strode through the heavy oak doors, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floors, a sound that resonated like a metronome heralding the start of something monumental. It was 9:27 a.m., precisely 12 minutes past the scheduled start of the hearing. Such a delay was uncharacteristic for Representative Crockett, whose impeccable reputation for punctuality had always set her apart. But that morning, an unavoidable emergency had commandeered her time. Moments earlier, she had been pulled into an urgent conference call with the House Oversight Committee regarding a classified whistleblower report implicating systemic abuse in North Texas prisons. With lives hanging in the balance, duty had forced her hand. The pressing call of public service left no room for compromise, even at the expense of a minor court delay. Inside the courtroom, affectionately known by locals as Pearson's Pit, because of the presiding Judge Michael Pearson's notorious penchant for belittling young lawyers and first-time offenders, an uneasy silence had settled over the gathered crowd. Every eye in the room turned as she entered, the murmur of anticipation punctuated by the collective intake of breath. Judge Pearson, an aging figure with deep-set eyes and a furrowed brow that seemed permanently etched in disdain, leaned forward from his elevated bench as though ready to pounce on his next target. "Well, well," he drawled, thumbing through his paperwork with theatrical disinterest. "Congresswoman or not, punctuality matters in my courtroom." Jasmine paused in the center of the room, her posture regal despite the circumstance. Adjusting the lapel of her dark blazer, she responded calmly and evenly, "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I received an urgent call." "Excuses?" Judge Pearson snapped, cutting her off abruptly as he slammed his gavel once, the sharp sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Contempt of court. $500 fine." His words spilled out with venom, punctuating the already heavy tension in the room. A ripple of gasps spread among those seated in the back, reporters and local dignitaries alike, while cameras discreetly recorded every moment. Jasmine's eyes flashed momentarily, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. "Are you fining me for being 12 minutes late due to a congressional emergency?" she inquired, her tone measured and challenging. Pearson's lips curled into a thin, disdainful smile as he retorted, "I'd fine anyone who disrespects this court." The subtle shift in his voice revealed that this was no mere matter of tardiness. It was personal. Even as the courtroom's atmosphere crackled with tension, it became clear that the underlying conflict was far more profound than the simple imposition of a fine. The session had been convened to address a trivial traffic violation, a clerical error that had mistakenly flagged Jasmine's name in a city vehicle registry. Determined to stand on equal footing with her constituents, she had opted to appear in person rather than delegate the matter to a staff member. What should have been a routine appearance had escalated into a full-blown confrontation that threatened to expose long-standing. Stepping forward to the podium, Jasmine sought permission to speak. "May I speak, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice resonating with quiet authority. "Speak? By all means entertain us," Judge Pearson mocked, leaning back in his chair with an air of theatrical superiority. Her expression remained unwavering as she responded, "Your Honor, I have served both as a public defender and as a legislator. I am fully aware of courtroom protocol and of judicial discretion and how its uneven application can have devastating consequences. I have witnessed firsthand how young defendants are berated, fined, or even jailed for minor infractions, while others walk away with only a warning." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. In that moment, the courtroom transformed into a battleground for a larger debate. The inequities of a system that too often silences those without influence. Judge Pearson's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward once again. "Are you implying this court is biased?" he challenged. "Yes," Jasmine countered steadily. "I am asserting that punitive overreach is all too common here, especially against those who, because of their age, race, or socioeconomic status, are less equipped to defend themselves. This is not solely about tardiness. It is about the systematic abuse of judicial power." For a few seconds, the courtroom hung in silence. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably as the weight of her words sank in. Pearson's composure wavered for a split second before he masked his unease with a thin, humorless laugh. "You think you can waltz in here and lecture me on ethics, Representative?" "Think again," he scoffed. "I have maintained order in this courtroom for over 30 years. You might have legal training, but I have decades of experience." The exchange had now become a spectacle, a confrontation in which the individual met the institution with both stakes impossibly high. Jasmine's gaze sharpened as she continued. "I will pay the $500 today, but I must also inform you that I have filed a formal inquiry with the Texas Commission on Judicial Conduct, along with supporting data on your courtroom practices. This is not personal. It is a necessary step to ensure accountability in a system where the powerful often escape scrutiny." At that moment, the tension in the room shifted. Reporters began whispering, their fingers dancing over their smartphones to capture every word. Outside the courthouse, Jasmine's communications director, Alyssa Torres, was fielding a barrage of calls from local media outlets, already buzzing with the news. "Congresswoman held in contempt by controversial judge" flashed across headlines. But inside Pearson's courtroom, the drama was only intensifying. Judge Pearson, clearly rattled yet striving to maintain control, attempted to reassert his authority. "You will find that complaints against judges often go nowhere, Congresswoman," he said, his tone icy as he tried to regain the upper hand. "If you wish to waste your time, be my guest." Jasmine's voice, calm and unyielding, cut through the tension. "This isn't about me or my status. It is about every person who has suffered under your rulings. If I, a well-known legislator with legal training, can be subjected to such treatment, imagine the fate of those without any protection or voice." The hearing was officially adjourned, yet no one in the courtroom moved. The moment was frozen, a silent protest against a system that had long operated unchecked. With one final dismissive slam of his gavel, Pearson commanded, "Get out!" Without missing a beat, Jasmine turned on her heel and exited, leaving behind an indelible impression of defiance and courage. Outside the courthouse, under the crisp morning light, reporters and protesters converged. Cameras captured every step she took, while the community began to rally around her words. A text notification from a former court clerk flickered on her phone. "You're not wrong about him. I have records." The message was a potent reminder that she was not alone in her fight. Once safely outside, Jasmine paused to address the press. "This morning, I was held in contempt for being 12 minutes late due to a congressional emergency, a matter of life and death. Yet the true contempt is inflicted every day on young, minority, and underprivileged individuals in this courtroom. Today, we begin to ask the hard questions. If someone like me, with all the advantages of power and privilege, can be treated this way, what does that say for those who have nothing?" Her words rang clear, carrying the weight of both personal indignation and systemic injustice. Inside the courthouse, Judge Pearson seethed in his chambers. He paced behind his mahogany desk, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages and calls, each one a reminder of his rapidly crumbling authority. His clerk, Dana, a young woman who had long grown accustomed to his tirades, stood silently by his side, her expression a mixture of resignation and apprehension. "She thinks this is going to scare me," Pearson muttered under his breath, flinging a legal pad across his desk. "A few reporters and a couple of tweets are all it takes for you to believe you can upend 30 years of judicial authority." Frustration mixed with fear as he stared at the incoming notifications. "Get me that hearing transcript, unedited," he barked, determined to salvage his control even as the storm outside his office gathered momentum. Meanwhile, in her Dallas district office, Jasmine had already convened a war room with her legislative staff, legal advisors, and 2 trusted former public defenders. Laptops glowed with spreadsheets and legal briefs, while coffee cups formed a perimeter on the long conference table. In a series of clipped, purposeful exchanges, she laid out her strategy. "I've already filed the misconduct inquiry," she declared, her eyes unwavering. "But anecdotal evidence is not enough. We need to compile data, patterns of sentencing disparities, judicial bias, racial profiling. We need every piece of evidence that shows a consistent pattern of punitive overreach in Judge Pearson's courtroom." Terrence, her lead legal researcher, nodded in agreement. "I'm cross-referencing dismissed motions, overridden objections, and sentencing data from the past 5 years. There's a noticeable spike in cases again." His voice was steady, laced with the certainty of hard facts, even as the team worked feverishly to compile hundreds of pages of records and testimonies. Alyssa, always the pragmatic communicator, interjected, "National outlets, MSNBC, CNN, even The Hill, are already reaching out for comment. We need to go public with this, but only strategically." Jasmine's response was immediate. "We go public, but this is not about personal vendettas. This is about systemic reform. We expose the pattern and demand accountability." As the day wore on, the courthouse exterior became a hive of protest. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the building, holding signs that bore messages like, "Justice shouldn't be personal and power is not above scrutiny." Their chants mingled with the sound of live recordings, and social media exploded with hashtags such as Pearson Pitfall and Justice Not Ego. Yet, while public sentiment swelled, Judge Pearson attempted to resume his duties. In an almost surreal scene that afternoon, he re-entered the courtroom to open the next hearing. "This morning's decorum was undermined by blatant political grandstanding," he began, his voice measured but with an edge of cold authority. "Let me be clear. This bench is not a stage, and this gavel is not a prop." His words, though delivered with precision, did little to quell the undercurrent of dissent that now pulsed through every corner of the courthouse. Across town, Jasmine met quietly with 2 young attorneys who had previously clerked under Pearson. Their expressions were cautious yet resolute. "You're right. Judge Pearson has always shown disdain for public defenders and younger lawyers," one of them, Marissa, admitted in a hushed tone. "He routinely overrules motions just to make a point." Jasmine's jaw tightened as she pressed further. "And what about the countless reports? Did you ever file them?" The attorney's reply was grim. "Every time. And every time we received no response." That conversation, along with countless other whispered accounts from former clerks and defendants, added fuel to an already blazing fire of public outrage. The courthouse was no longer a remote symbol of judicial authority. It had become a microcosm of the systemic problems that plagued the justice system nationwide. As the afternoon waned into evening, the drama escalated further. On national television later that day, under the bright glare of studio lights, Jasmine sat down with a seasoned political anchor. Her interview was calm and measured, a stark contrast to the heated exchanges of the morning. "I didn't challenge Judge Pearson simply because I am a politician," she explained. "I challenged him because I am a lawyer and a black woman who has witnessed firsthand what unchecked judicial power looks like when it collides with vulnerable communities. A $500 fine might be a slap on the wrist for someone like me, but for many, it's the difference between freedom and incarceration." Her words resonated deeply, and before the interview ended, the video clip of her defiant courtroom appearance had already gone viral. By the next morning, Judge Pearson's courtroom was under a microscope. A coalition of civil rights attorneys announced that they were reviewing hundreds of his past cases. Jasmine's office was inundated with anonymous emails detailing countless personal accounts of injustice, stories from former defendants, public defenders, and even clerks who risked everything to speak out. One brief message read simply, "He gave me 30 days for asking to call my lawyer. I was only 19. The stark contrast between his treatment of powerful figures and those without a voice. Under mounting pressure, state legislators began calling for an inquiry. The Texas Judicial Council convened an emergency session to review the growing number of public complaints, and the State Bar Association reached out to former defendants to collect their testimonies. At the center of this maelstrom stood Representative Crockett, unbowed and determined, meticulously gathering evidence, documenting every instance of misconduct, and preparing to transform her personal ordeal into a catalyst for systemic change. Determined not to let Pearson's unchecked power continue, Jasmine returned to the courthouse a few days later, this time not as a defendant, but as a silent observer. Clad in simple attire and carrying nothing but a notepad, she settled into a seat at the back of the courtroom. Without drawing attention to herself, she absorbed every detail of the proceedings, knowing that every moment could provide critical insight into a deeply flawed system. That morning, the judge presided over the case of Leon Vasquez, a 22-year-old man facing a disorderly conduct charge on what appeared to be the flimsiest of evidence. Despite his lawyer's motion to dismiss the case due to lack of evidence, Judge Pearson denied the request without explanation. When Leon timidly raised his hand to object, a move that could have been seen as an attempt to speak up, Pearson cut him off sharply. "Another word, and you'll be in contempt," he warned ominously. The silence that followed was heavy with fear and disbelief. Moments later, without further ado, Judge Pearson pronounced a sentence. 30 days in county lockup. Perhaps that will teach you courtroom decorum. A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. Jasmine's pen froze as she scribbled notes furiously. The young man's lawyer leaned in to whisper a plea for restraint, but it was too late. Pearson's tirade had already inflicted a scar on the public consciousness. Outside, the news was spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, social media erupted with condemnations of Pearson's harsh sentencing and the blatant disregard for fairness. Jasmine's determination had now become a rallying cry. In a matter of days, her office received an overwhelming flood of first-hand accounts, legal documentation, and video footage. Some leaked by sympathetic clerks, others recorded discreetly by defendants and their families. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a judge whose demeanor and decisions were steeped in bias and punitive overreach. It was a mosaic of injustice that could no longer be ignored. With the public rallying behind her, Jasmine turned the personal confrontation into a full-scale campaign for change. She drafted a bipartisan bill titled the Courtroom Accountability and Fairness Enforcement Act, or CAFE, which called for mandatory judicial bias training, increased oversight of local courts, and the establishment of an independent review board composed of former judges, public defenders, and community advocates. The bill was not just symbolic. It was a call for a radical restructuring of a system that had allowed unchecked power to flourish behind closed doors. During a testimony before a House subcommittee, Jasmine recounted her experiences with calm, unflinching candor. "I am not here to air a personal grievance," she told the panel. "I am here to expose a system where silence is mistaken for fairness. I have spoken with defendants who were punished for speaking out, with attorneys who feared retaliation for challenging authority, and with clerks who were forced to remain silent. We must ask ourselves, what message does it send when justice is feared more than crime?" Her testimony, backed by hundreds of pages of evidence and the voices of those who had suffered, resonated powerfully with lawmakers, who began to realize that reform was not only necessary. Public protests, community forums, and heated debates followed as the bill advanced through both houses of Congress. Local media outlets provided continuous coverage of the unfolding judicial reckoning, and national networks picked up the story as a symbol of the broader fight for civil rights. The pressure mounted relentlessly on Judge Pearson, whose once ironclad authority began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and formal investigations. In the midst of this storm, the Texas Judicial Conduct Commission announced a formal review of Pearson's courtroom practices. The inquiry revealed disturbing patterns, excessive contempt charges, disproportionate sentencing, and internal memos in which he referred to defendants as children needing a harsh lesson. The evidence was damning. Ultimately, the commission's findings led to Pearson's temporary suspension pending further investigation, and within days, an emergency audit confirmed the systemic issues that had been ignored for far too long. As the truth came to light, the public response was both swift and resolute. Protests gathered outside the courthouse every day, with citizens demanding not only accountability, but also comprehensive reforms to prevent future abuses of power. In a symbolic act of defiance, a mural soon appeared on the side of a local community legal aid center in Dallas. The vibrant artwork depicted Jasmine Crockett standing boldly outside the courthouse, one hand holding the scale of justice and the other pushing open a massive courtroom door. Beneath it, bold letters declared, "Justice isn't earned in silence, it's demanded in presence." Even as Judge Pearson faced permanent removal from the bench, his final attempt to salvage dignity came during a judicial conduct hearing. The atmosphere in the hearing chamber was electric, a room filled with former clerks, public defenders, and citizens who had endured his harsh rulings. When Jasmine took the stand, her calm and measured voice recounted not only the events of that fateful morning, but also the long history of injustice she had witnessed. "I am here not for personal vindication," she declared, her eyes locking onto each member of the panel, "but to show that our courts must be accountable to the people they serve. When a judge uses contempt as a tool of personal vendetta rather than as a means to uphold dignity, the very foundation of justice is at risk." Her testimony was met with a heavy silence, as if the room itself was absorbing the gravity of her words. The panel's subsequent decision, to place Pearson under temporary suspension pending further investigation, was a turning point. It was not an outright victory, but it signaled that the system was finally listening. 3 days later, an emergency audit of Pearson's courtroom records confirmed a litany of abuses: frequent dismissals of valid motions, a staggering 42 confirmed contempt charges against defendants under the age of 25 for non-disruptive behavior, and an overall pattern of judicial overreach. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Pearson was permanently removed from the bench. Jasmine Crockett returned to Congress as a changed woman, no longer just a legislator, but also a symbol of resistance against a flawed judicial system. With her bill, now affectionately known as CAFE, gaining bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, the reform process accelerated. The legislation was signed into law amid a press conference that celebrated the voices of those who had been silenced for too long, marking the beginning of a new era of transparency and accountability in Texas courts. In the months that followed, the impact of the judicial reckoning resonated far beyond Dallas. Courtrooms across the state and eventually the country began to adopt new practices aimed at eliminating bias and ensuring fairness. Community oversight boards were established, mandatory judicial training programs were implemented, and a series of reforms provided a long-overdue check on judicial power. Jasmine's journey, from a defendant in a courtroom battle to the driving force behind systemic change, became a beacon of hope for countless individuals who had once felt powerless in the face of institutional injustice. Standing before a sea of supporters at a celebratory rally in downtown Dallas, Jasmine reflected on the transformative events that had unfolded. "I never set out to become a symbol," she admitted, her voice soft yet determined. "I only wanted to see fairness restored for every person who has ever sat in a courtroom, fearing that justice would be arbitrarily denied. Today, we have shown that when the people come together, when we speak out against injustice, we can change the system from within." Her words were met with resounding applause and a standing ovation, a tribute not only to her courage, but to the collective will of a community demanding real, lasting change. Judge Pearson's legacy, once defined by a cold disregard for the vulnerable, was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that unchecked power, no matter how entrenched, can and must be challenged. In the aftermath of his removal, numerous former clerks, public defenders, and community advocates stepped forward to share their stories, each one reinforcing the urgent need for continued vigilance and reform. The scandal had sparked a movement, one that would reshape the landscape of judicial accountability for years to come. The courtroom showdown had been a catalyst, a match struck in the darkness that ignited a blaze of transformation. And as the final chapters of that turbulent day were written, the words of Representative Crockett echoed far beyond the walls of Pearson's pit. They resonated with every person who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been ignored, and every life that had been touched by the promise of true justice. Today, Dallas stands as a testament to the power of individual courage and collective action. The reforms born from that fiery confrontation serve as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a solitary battle, but a shared journey. And in every courtroom where a gavel falls, there now exists the hope that, just as one woman's resolve changed the course of history, so too can the persistent call for fairness transform our